In the wind-swept hills of New Mexico, Silas Creed owns the grandest ranch in the territory, but never attends his own parties. The townsfolk call him the Phantom Rancher, a wealthy cowboy who buried his past so deep that even he won't look it in the eye. When his aging housekeeper retires, a quiet girl named Mira Callan takes her place. She's soft-spoken, steady-handed, and invisible to most, but not to Silas. There's something in her presence that begins to thaw the ice he's lived behind for years. How she hums while dusting his study, leaves warm bread by the hearth, tends to the graves behind the barn with gentle hands. What Mira doesn't know is that Silas lost his young wife in a fire he still blames himself for. What Silas doesn't know is that Mira carries wounds of her own. But when her estranged family returns to claim the ranch's land, will Silas retreat into his past again, or finally fight for the future she gave him courage to dream of? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Creed Ranch as Mira Callan stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her single carpetbag clutched in weathered hands. The driver tipped his hat and rumbled away, leaving her standing before iron gates that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself. Beyond them, a mansion rose from the high desert like something conjured from a dream, or perhaps a memory of better times. She had expected grandeur, but not this overwhelming sense of emptiness that seemed to seep from every perfectly maintained board and polished window. The house was beautiful, in the way a mausoleum might be beautiful, pristine, untouchable, and utterly devoid of warmth. As she approached the front door, it opened before she could knock. The man who emerged made her breath catch in her throat. Though she couldn't say why, Silas Creed was tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair that had once been black as a moonless night. His eyes held the peculiar stillness of deep water, and when he looked at her, she felt as though he was seeing something she hadn't meant to show. "Miss Callan." His voice carried the weight of authority tempered by something she couldn't name. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the kind of weariness that comes from carrying too much for too long. "Mr. Creed." She offered a small curtsy, unsure of the proper protocol in such circumstances. "I'm grateful for the position." He studied her for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw. A woman of 28, who had learned to make herself small, to move through the world like a shadow, so as not to disturb anyone's peace. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress, though clean and mended with careful stitches, spoke of a life lived without excess. "Mrs. Henderson left detailed instructions," he said finally, stepping aside to let her enter. "I trust you'll find everything in order." The interior of the house took her breath away. Polished hardwood floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers, and rich carpets muffled their footsteps as he led her through rooms that seemed designed for entertaining dozens, yet felt as though no laughter had echoed through them in years. Portraits lined the walls, stern-faced men and women who watched their passage with oil-painted eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "The kitchen is through here," Silas continued, his tone businesslike. "Mrs. Henderson prepared most meals simple. I'm not particular about fancy cooking, just consistent." Mira nodded, taking mental notes as they moved through the house. In the sitting room, she noticed a layer of dust on the piano keys, as though music had been forbidden. The library held thousands of books, but the chairs positioned for reading looked unused, their leather surfaces uncracked by the weight of human comfort. It was in his study that she caught her first glimpse of the man behind the careful composure. The room smelled of leather and tobacco, with undertones of something else. Sadness, perhaps, or the particular staleness that comes from a space where someone spends too much time alone. His desk was organized with military precision, but she noticed how his eyes avoided looking toward a particular drawer, as though it contained something he couldn't bear to acknowledge. "You'll have Sundays free," he was saying, "and I prefer my privacy in the evenings." Mrs. Henderson found it best to complete most tasks during the day. Of course, sir. She paused, then added gently, I understand you value your solitude. I'll be sure to respect that. Something flickered across his features, surprise, maybe, that she had understood so quickly. The townspeople talk, he said, after a moment. I imagine you've heard stories. I've heard whispers, she admitted, but I've learned that whispers often tell us more about the whisperers than about the truth. This time, his look held a different quality, as though he was reassessing something he had already decided about her. Your room is upstairs, third door on the right. Supper is at 6. I take my meals alone. She nodded, understanding the boundary he was drawing. As he turned to leave, she caught sight of something that made her heart clench. A small, charred music box tucked behind a stack of papers on his desk. It was barely visible, clearly placed where he thought no one would notice, yet positioned so that he could see it if he chose to look. The music box was damaged beyond repair, its delicate mechanism warped by heat, its painted surface cracked and blackened. Yet he kept it there, this remnant of something beautiful that had been destroyed. In that moment, she understood that Silas Creed was a man haunted not just by loss, but by the weight of surviving when something precious had not. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, she could hear him moving about upstairs, footsteps that paused outside the dining room, then retreated. When she set his place at the long table, she left the food under a cloth and retired to her room, understanding that some hungers are too complicated to share with strangers. From her window, she could see the small cemetery behind the barn, where 3 graves rested under the endless New Mexico sky. Even in the gathering dusk, she could see that one grave was tended with particular care. Fresh flowers, a carefully maintained headstone, and what looked like a wooden cross that had been carved by loving hands. As she prepared for sleep, Mira reflected on the strange contradiction of this place. A house filled with everything money could buy, yet empty of the things that made a house a home. A man who possessed vast wealth but lived like a hermit, surrounded by reminders of a life he seemed afraid to fully embrace or completely abandon. She had come here seeking nothing more than honest work and a place to rest her weary spirit. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself wondering if perhaps they had both been brought to this moment for reasons neither of them yet understood. The general store in town buzzed with the kind of comfortable gossip that small communities cultivate like prized gardens. Mira had ventured into town for supplies, her list written in careful script, her coin purse holding exactly what Silas had given her for household necessities. She moved quietly between the shelves, hoping to complete her errands without drawing attention, but the whispered conversations seemed to follow her like shadows. "That's her," came a voice from behind a display of preserves. "The new girl up." At the Creed place, Mira pretended to study the labels on various tins, but her ears sharpened despite herself. She had learned long ago that people often revealed their truest thoughts when they believed themselves unobserved. "Poor thing," another voice replied. "Does she have any idea what she's walked into?" The first voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, whose reputation for knowing everyone's business was matched only by her talent for sharing it. I doubt anyone told her about Elena, or about what happened that night. Mira's fingers stilled on a can of peaches. Elena. The name hung in the air like incense in a church, heavy with reverence and sorrow. 10 years now, isn't it? This from an older man whose voice carried the gravelly tone of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. Hard to believe it's been that long since the fire. Silas hasn't been the same since, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice dropping to what she probably considered a whisper, but which carried clearly through the small store. Used to come to town regular-like back when Eleanor was alive. They'd attend church socials, and she'd play piano at the community gatherings. Prettiest voice you ever heard, that girl had. Mira found herself leaning closer, drawn into the story, despite knowing she shouldn't be listening. But there was something in the tone of these voices, not malicious gossip, but the kind of shared grief that comes when a community loses something precious. He blamed himself, you know, the older man said, though Lord knows it wasn't his fault. House fires happen, especially out there where help is so far away. But Silas, he was away on business that night. If he'd been home— Now, Thomas, you know better than to speak of such things, Mrs. Patterson chided, though gently. What's done is done. But that man has carried the weight of it all these years like it was his personal cross to bear. Military training, Thomas replied with the authority of someone who had served himself. Silas was decorated in the war, you know, Purple Heart and everything. Men like that, they're trained to protect, to take responsibility. When they can't, well, it eats at them different than it would ordinary folks. Mira selected her items with deliberate care, processing what she was hearing. A military medal that would explain the precision of his movements, the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. But it also explained the weight she sensed in him, the burden of a protector who had failed to protect what mattered most. Remember how he used to laugh? Mrs. Patterson's voice had grown wistful. Before Elena died, Silas Creed had the warmest laugh you ever heard. Now look at him, living up there like a ghost, never coming to town except when he absolutely must. Can't say I blame him, Thomas mused. Everywhere he goes, people stare, some with pity, some with curiosity. Neither one's comfortable when you're trying to heal. As Mira approached the counter to pay for her purchases, Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to one of kindly concern. You settling in all right up there, dear? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Creed has been considerate. He's a good man, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, as though defending him against unspoken accusations. Don't let anyone tell you different. What happened to Elena nearly destroyed him, but underneath all that pain, he's still got the finest heart in 3 counties. Thomas nodded his agreement. Elena used to say he was like a deep well, still waters, but pure and true if you knew how to draw from them. The mention of Elena's own words about her husband sent a strange pang through Mira's chest. She could almost see them together. The laughing man these people remembered, and the woman whose voice had once filled the community gatherings with song. Thank you, Mira said quietly, accepting her wrapped purchases. I appreciate your kindness. As she walked back toward the ranch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desert landscape, Mira found herself seeing Silas Creed with new understanding. The careful distance he maintained, the way he moved through his own house, like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. It all made sense now. He wasn't cold by nature. He was a man who had learned to protect himself the only way he knew how, by ensuring he could never again lose something so completely that its absence would hollow out his very soul. But as she climbed the steps to the front porch, packages in her arms, Mira felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. The desire to reach across the careful distance someone had built around themselves and offer, however quietly, the possibility of companionship. She thought of the charred music box in his study, of the tended grave behind the barn, of a man who kept reminders of love close, even as he held love itself at arm's length. Perhaps, she thought as she pushed open the front door, healing was not always about forgetting the past, but about learning to carry it with grace. 3 weeks had passed in careful rhythm, Mira moving through the house like morning mist, tending to tasks with quiet efficiency, while Silas maintained his deliberate distance. She had learned his patterns: coffee at dawn, solitary meals, long hours in his study or walking the ranch boundaries. He seemed content with their arrangement, perhaps even relieved that she required no conversation beyond the practical necessities of household management. But curiosity, Mira had learned, was a persistent companion. It was while cleaning the upstairs hallway that she noticed the door. Unlike the others, which stood open or unlocked, this one bore a skeleton key that had been turned with deliberate finality. Something about its very deliberateness drew her attention, the way it seemed to announce its secrets while simultaneously forbidding access to them. She had passed it daily for weeks, always with the same prickle of awareness, the same wondering. Mrs. Henderson's notes had mentioned every room in the house except this one. Even Silas, during his brief tour, had walked past it without acknowledgement, as though the door were invisible to him. Today, as autumn light slanted through the hallway window, creating patterns on the polished floor, Mira found herself pausing. She pressed her ear to the door, hearing nothing but the settling sounds old houses make when they hold their breath. Her hand found the brass handle, and to her surprise, it turned easily. The key, she realized, was merely for show, a psychological barrier rather than a physical one. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and Mira stepped into a room that time had forgotten. Sunlight, filtered through lace curtains that had yellowed with age, illuminated a woman's sitting room, preserved exactly as it had been left. A sewing basket sat beside a chair, needle and thread still attached to a half-finished embroidery hoop depicting wildflowers. Books lay open on side tables, as though their reader had merely stepped away for tea. The air smelled of lavender and old roses and something else, the particular stillness that comes to places where happiness once lived. But it was the photograph on the mantelpiece that drew Mira forward, like a moth to flame. In an ornate silver frame, a couple looked back at her with the particular glow that comes to people who have found their match in the world. The man was unmistakably Silas, but younger, his face unmarked by the careful control she had come to. No, his arm encircled a woman of ethereal beauty. Elena, surely, whose dark hair caught light like silk, and whose smile seemed to hold all the joy in the world. They were standing before the fireplace in what must have been this very room, and the love between them was so tangible that Mira felt like an intruder, witnessing something too intimate for outside eyes. This was how love looked, she realized, when it was freely given and completely received. Radiant, transforming, the kind of connection that changes the very air around two people. She reached for the photograph without thinking, drawn by something she couldn't name. Perhaps it was the desire to understand the depth of loss that had carved such careful distance into Silas's features, or perhaps it was simple human longing to touch something that had known such happiness. "What are you doing in here?" The voice cut through the reverent silence like a blade, and Mira spun to find Silas filling the doorway. But this was not the controlled, polite man she had come to know. This was someone whose composure had shattered completely, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. The door was unlocked," she stammered, still clutching the photograph. "I didn't mean what?" His voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes storms. "Didn't mean to violate the one space in this house that was meant to remain untouched. Didn't mean to put your hands on things that don't belong to you." The photograph seemed to burn in her hands, and she quickly set it back on the mantelpiece. "Mr. Creed, I'm sorry. You were only what? Curious, bored, looking for something to gossip about when you returned to town." Each word was precisely delivered, designed to wound. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could satisfy your curiosity about the tragic widower and his dead wife without consequence?" Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from a sudden flare of her own temper. "That's not what this was. I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" He stepped into the room, and she could see the effort it cost him. His hands were clenched at his sides, and something in his breathing suggested he was fighting for control. "Everyone wants to know about Elena. Everyone wants to understand what happened here. Well, let me save you the trouble of further investigation." He moved to a cabinet she hadn't noticed and withdrew something wrapped in faded silk. With deliberate, almost ceremonial movements, he unwrapped what proved to be Eleanor's wedding dress, ivory silk that had survived time but bore the unmistakable brown stains of smoke damage. "This is what's left," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "This is what I saved from the fire while she—" He stopped abruptly, as though the words were too heavy to complete. Mira felt tears prick her eyes, not for herself, but for the Man standing before her, holding the remnants of a life that had been perfect before it was destroyed. "Silas," she said softly, using his given name without thinking. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sorry for what? For her death? For my failure to protect her? Or sorry you were caught satisfying your morbid curiosity? Sorry that you've been carrying this alone," she said quietly. "Sorry that someone as good as you has been living with this pain for so long that you've forgotten there might be another way." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, that she had seen his goodness rather than his anger, but it was quickly replaced by renewed fury, as though kindness were more threatening than condemnation. "Get out," he said quietly. "Pack your things and leave. I thought I could, but I can't. I can't have someone else in this house pretending to understand, pretending to care. Not again." Mira stood her ground, though everything in his posture suggested he was a man on the edge of complete collapse. "I'm not pretending anything, and I'm not leaving." "You're dismissed," he said, his voice returning to that deadly calm. "I'll pay you through the month, but I want you gone by morning." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing past the anger to the fear beneath it, the terror of a man who had learned that opening his heart meant risking its complete destruction. Then, with a dignity that seemed to surprise them both, she curtsied slightly. "As you wish, Mr. Creed," she said. "But before I go, you should know that what I saw in this room wasn't tragedy. It was love, the kind of love that most people spend their whole lives hoping to find. You're right to protect it, but wrong to think that honoring it means living as though you died with her." She walked past him toward the door, then paused. Elena was beautiful, but I think what made her beautiful was how happy she was, how loved. Maybe the best way to honor her memory isn't to preserve this room like a tomb, but to remember what it felt like to be the kind of man who could make someone that happy. And with that, she left him standing alone among the preserved remnants of a love that had been perfect, devastating, and irreplaceable. Mira did not pack her things. Instead, she rose the next morning as she had every morning since arriving at the Creed ranch, prepared coffee before dawn, and set about her duties, with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her first weeks. When Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway, clearly expecting to find her gone, she simply poured his coffee and set it on the table beside a plate of fresh biscuits. "I thought I made myself clear," he said, though his voice lacked the sharp edge of the previous day. "You did." She continued kneading dough for the day's bread, her movements steady and unhurried. "You told me to pack my things and leave. I've decided not to." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could feel him struggling with how to respond to such quiet defiance. She had gambled that beneath his anger lay a man too fundamentally decent to physically remove a woman from his home, and too weary to sustain rage indefinitely. "Miss Callan, Mira," she corrected gently. "And before you repeat your dismissal, you should know that I've already written to Mrs. Henderson. I told her that I'm staying, and that if you try to send me away again, she should come up here herself to knock some sense into you." Despite himself, something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. Mrs. Henderson, as they both knew, was a force of nature who had raised 7 sons and buried 2 husbands, and who regarded Silas with the fond exasperation of someone who had known him since boyhood. "You can't simply decide to stay," he said, but the protest sounded half-hearted even to his own ears. "I can, and I have." She shaped the dough into loaves with practiced hands. "You can ignore me if you wish. You can eat your meals in your study and pretend I don't exist. But I'll be here, doing the work I was hired to do, until you're ready to admit that maybe, just maybe, you don't actually want to be alone as much as you think you do." He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he had simply left. But when she finally looked up, he was still standing there, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why?" he asked finally, It was such a simple question, but she sensed that her answer would determine whether the fragile equilibrium they had built could survive yesterday's devastation. She set down her bread and truly looked at him, this man who had been carved hollow by loss, but who still carried himself with the bearing of someone who had once been whole. "Because," she said carefully, "I know what it's like to convince yourself that you're better off alone. And I know how much courage it takes to let someone stay, even when part of you wants them to." Something shifted in his expression, a crack. "In the armor he wore so carefully, you don't know anything about my situation. I know that yesterday, when you found me in that room, you could have simply told me to leave. Instead, you showed me Elena's dress. You shared your pain with me, even though it cost you everything to do it." She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone placing stepping stones across rushing water. "That tells me that somewhere beneath all that careful distance you want to be understood. You just don't know how to ask for it." He was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, less like a wall and more like a consideration. Finally, he moved to the table and sat down, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup as though it were an anchor. "I don't know how to be around people anymore," he admitted quietly. "After Elena died, everyone wanted to help, wanted to comfort me, but their comfort felt like being asked to pretend the wound wasn't as deep as it was. So I stopped trying." Mira nodded, understanding more than he might expect. "People mean well, but sometimes their comfort is more about making themselves feel better than helping you heal." "Yes," the word came out like a sigh of relief. "Exactly that." She returned to her bread, allowing him the dignity of not being stared at while he grappled with his admission. But she could feel the weight of his presence, the way he seemed to be testing what it felt like to share space with someone who didn't expect him to be anything other than what he was. After a while, he spoke again. "The room, Elena's room. I haven't been in there since the week after her funeral. Mrs. Henderson insisted I preserve her things, said I'd regret it if I didn't, but I could never bring myself to go back. It's beautiful." Mira said softly. You can see how happy she was there, how loved. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. She used to sit by the window in the evenings, working on her embroidery. She'd hum while she sewed, little melodies she made up. The whole house felt different when she was in it, alive. Mira found herself picturing it, the woman from the photograph bringing music and laughter to these rooms that now held only echoes. "Tell me about her," she said gently. To her surprise, he did. Slowly, haltingly, he began to share memories of Elena, how she had insisted on planting wildflowers in places where they had no business growing, how she could coax music from the old piano that had sat silent for years, how she had a way of making even ordinary moments feel touched by grace. As he spoke, Mira continued her work, sensing that he needed the rhythm of ordinary tasks to anchor him as he ventured into territory he had avoided for years. And gradually, she began to see glimpses of the man Elena had fallen in love with, someone capable of deep tenderness, of joy, of the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. When he finally fell silent, the kitchen felt different somehow, as though the simple act of speaking Elena's name aloud had shifted something fundamental in the house's atmosphere. He began, then stopped, clearly unsure how to navigate this new territory. "You should do whatever feels right." Mira said simply, "There's no rule that says how long grief should last, or what shape healing should take. You loved her completely. That kind of love doesn't just disappear because time passes." He looked at her then, with something approaching wonder, as though she had spoken a truth he had needed to hear, but hadn't known how to find. "Most people think I should be moving on by now. Most people haven't loved the way you loved Elena." She shaped the last loaf and set it aside to rise. "And most people don't understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to carry someone's memory with grace instead of guilt." That afternoon, she found him standing in the doorway of Elena's room, not entering but no longer fleeing, and when she walked past with an armload of linens, he didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, he stood there, allowing himself to remember, while behind him, Mira went about the simple, necessary work of keeping a house alive. Later, she would find fresh flowers on Elena's grave, wildflowers from the meadow beyond the barn, placed there by hands that were finally beginning to remember that love could be honored through living as well as through preservation. It was a small thing, perhaps, but Mira understood that the smallest gestures often carried the greatest weight. The hand-carved wooden cross that marked Elena's resting place stood straight and proud in the evening light, its simple beauty speaking of love that had learned to express itself through service rather than sorrow. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mira felt that she might actually be home. October brought a subtle shift to the ranch, as though the changing season had given both Silas and Mira permission to inhabit the same space with less careful distance. It began with small things. Silas lingering over his morning coffee instead of retreating immediately to his study, Mira humming softly as she worked without worrying that the sound might disturb him. Their conversations remained brief and practical, but the quality of their silences had changed. Where once there had been the tense quiet of two people avoiding each other, there was now something approaching companionship, the comfortable silence that comes when two souls recognize they need not perform for each other. It was on a particularly golden afternoon that Mira discovered Elena's Bible. She had been cleaning the sitting room when she noticed a slim volume that had slipped behind the cushions of the window seat. The leather cover was worn soft by countless hands, and the pages fell open naturally to passages that had been read and reread, marked with faded ribbons and gentle annotations in a feminine hand. Mira found herself drawn into the marginalia, Elena's thoughts and prayers written in careful script alongside verses about love, loss, and hope. Here was evidence of a faith that had been lived rather than merely proclaimed, a spiritual life marked by questions as much as certainty. She was so absorbed in the tender intimacy of these private thoughts that she didn't notice Silas until he cleared his throat softly. She looked up, expecting to see the familiar flash of protective anger, but instead found something closer to resignation. "That was hers," he said simply. "I know." Mira closed the Bible gently, but made no move to hide it. "I hope you don't mind." The words, "They're beautiful." To her surprise, he moved closer rather than retreating. Elena read from it every morning. She'd sit right there. He nodded toward the window seat and watched the sunrise while she prayed. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud, especially when she was worried about something. What kinds of things worried her? Mira asked genuinely, curious about the woman whose presence still seemed to inhabit every corner of the house. Silas settled into the chair across from the window seat, his movements suggesting this was the first time he had chosen to sit in this room since Elena's death. The drought one summer, whether the mare would survive a difficult birth, my nightmares from the war. He paused, then added quietly, whether we'd ever have children. The last admission hung in the air between them, a glimpse into private sorrow that went deeper than Mira had imagined. She waited, sensing that he was deciding whether to trust her with more of his carefully guarded pain. "We tried for 5 years, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena wanted children so badly she could taste it. Every month that passed without it broke her heart a little more. She'd come to this window and read, looking for some kind of sign that God hadn't forgotten us." Mira opened the Bible again, this time to a passage that Elena had marked heavily. Verses about hope deferred making the heart sick, but desire fulfilled being a tree of life. The margins were filled with Elena's prayers, her pleas for patience, her attempts to find peace with God's timing. "She never lost faith," Silas said, following Mira's gaze. "Even when I did. Especially when I did." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I used to think that if we'd had children, maybe she wouldn't have been alone that night. Maybe she would have been in a different part of the house. Maybe is a dangerous word," Mira said softly. "It can drive you mad if you let it." He looked at her sharply, and she realized she had spoken from her own experience. "You sound as though you know." Mira traced her finger along the Bible's worn spine, choosing her words carefully. "I know what it's like to lose the future you thought you were going to have. To wonder if different choices might have led to different outcomes." She paused, then met his eyes. "But I also know that maybe is just another word for torture, if you use it to punish yourself for things that were never in your control." They sat in comfortable silence after that, the autumn light slanting through the windows and touching everything with gold. Mira continued reading Elena's annotations, occasionally sharing a particularly beautiful passage or thought. Silas listened, sometimes responding with memories of when Eleanor had shared the same verses with him. As the afternoon wore on, Mira began to understand something about the man sitting across from her. His love for Eleanor hadn't ended with her. Death, if anything, it had deepened, becoming something approaching worship. But worship, she realized, could become a prison, just as surely as indifference could. She had beautiful handwriting, Mira observed, running her finger along one of Elena's notes. "She taught school before we married," Silas said with something that might have been pride. "Children adored her. She had this way of making even the most difficult lessons seem like adventures." "I can see that." Mira turned to a page where Elena had drawn small flowers in the margins next to verses about growth and seasons. She saw beauty everywhere, didn't she? Everything was more beautiful when Elena looked at it. His voice carried no self-pity, just simple truth. She could find something to love in the most ordinary moments. I used to tease her about it. But the truth is, she taught me how to see. And now? He was quiet for so long that Mira wondered if she had overstepped. But finally, he spoke. "Now I see too much. I see her absence in everything. The empty chair at the table, the silent piano, the garden she planted that I can't bear to tend, but can't bring myself to let die." Mira closed the Bible and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of Elena's faith, her hopes, her love for the man who still carried her memory like a sacred trust. "Maybe," she said carefully, "the point isn't to stop seeing her absence. Maybe it's to learn to see her presence too." Silas looked at her with something approaching wonder. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe she's not just in the empty chair. Maybe she's also in your memory of her laughter, in the wildflowers that still grow where she planted them, in the way you still set the table for two without thinking about it." Mira paused, then added gently, "Maybe loving someone doesn't end when they die. Maybe it just changes shape." Something shifted in his expression, as though she had offered him a possibility he hadn't dared consider. They sat in silence as the sun continued its journey across the sky, two people learning that grief shared was somehow more bearable than grief carried alone. When evening came, Silas didn't retreat to his study as usual. Instead, he asked if Mira would read aloud from Elena's Bible, and she did, her voice filling the sitting room with words that Elena had once found comfort in. As she read, she could see him remembering, not just Elena's death, but Elena's life, and perhaps beginning to understand that honoring one didn't require abandoning the other. That night, for the first time since Elena's death, the house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home where love had lived, and where love might yet live again. The storm arrived without warning, as desert storms often do. One moment, the sky was clear, and the next it was black with clouds that seemed to swallow the very light. Thunder rolled across the landscape like artillery fire, and Mira found herself thinking of Silas's military service, wondering if such sounds brought him unwelcome memories. She was preparing supper when the first bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the kitchen in stark white relief. The thunder that followed shook the windows, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with violent weather. Some fears she had learned, ran deeper than reason. But it was the sound from the study that made her set down her wooden spoon and move quickly through the house. It wasn't quite a shout, but it wasn't normal speech either. Something between a command and a plea that spoke of someone wrestling with demons that existed beyond the storm. She found Silas pressed against the far wall of his study, his breathing rapid and shallow, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The careful composure she had come to know was completely absent, replaced by something raw and primal, a man in the grip of memories that had ambushed him without mercy. Silas. She kept her voice soft, instinctively understanding that whatever was happening in his mind, she needed to be careful not to startle him further. He didn't seem to hear her. His hands were pressed flat against the wall behind him, and she could see the tremor in his fingers, the way his body seemed to be bracing against something that existed only in his memory. Another flash of lightning filled the room, and this time his reaction was unmistakable. A flinch that spoke of battlefields and burning buildings, of a mind that couldn't quite separate past from present when the storm sounds triggered memories too vivid to dismiss. The fire, he whispered, and she realized he wasn't seeing his study at all. I can smell the smoke. I can hear her calling for me, but I can't get to her in time. Mira's heart clenched as she understood what was happening. The storm had somehow unlocked the carefully contained memories of that terrible night, and Silas was reliving Eleanor's death with all the helpless horror of someone watching disaster unfold in slow motion. Moving slowly, she crossed to where he stood, and without asking permission, placed her hand gently on his arm. "Silas, you're here. You're in your study. There's no fire." "She's calling for me," he repeated, his voice breaking. "But I'm too far away. I'm always too far away." Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. This time, Silas's knees buckled, and Mira found herself supporting more of his weight than she had expected. "Help me," she said quietly, guiding him toward the chair behind his desk. "Sit down before you fall down." He allowed himself to be led, but his breathing was still ragged, his eyes still seeing horrors from a decade past. Mira knelt beside his chair, maintaining the gentle contact that seemed to anchor him to the present moment. "Listen to my voice," she said, the words coming from some deep well of instinct. "You're safe. The fire was 10 years ago. Elena isn't trapped. You don't need to save anyone right now." "I failed her," he whispered, his voice so broken that it nearly undid her. "I was supposed to protect her, and I failed." Mira rose and moved to the small closet where she kept her few personal belongings. From the bottom of her carpet bag, she withdrew something she hadn't looked at in months, a quilted blanket that had been her mother's, one of the few things she owned that connected her to the love she had known before the world taught her that. Love was dangerous. The blanket smelled faintly of lavender and years of careful keeping, and when she wrapped it around Silas's shoulders, she was offering him something more precious than gold, the comfort that had once soothed her own broken spirit. "Sometimes," she said softly, settling into the chair beside his desk, "the hardest truth to accept is that we can't save everyone we love from everything that might hurt them. But failing to prevent tragedy doesn't mean you failed to love well." The storm continued to rage outside, but gradually Silas's breathing began to slow. The blanket seemed to ground him, its weight and warmth creating a barrier between his traumatized memories and the present moment. "Tell me about something else," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "Tell me about anything. That isn't fire or death or failure." Mira thought for a moment, then began to speak about the small garden she had tended as a child, how her mother had taught her that even the hardest soil could nurture life if you were patient and gentle with it. She talked about the satisfaction of watching seeds become flowers, about the way morning glories opened with the sun and closed with the evening, about how some plants needed storms to grow strong. As she spoke, she watched his face gradually relax. the terrible tension leaving his shoulders as her voice wove a different kind of story around them. The storm outside began to move on, the thunder growing more distant, but she continued talking, understanding somehow that he needed the sound of her voice more than he needed silence. When she finally fell quiet, he turned to look at her with eyes that were still wounded, but no longer lost. "Your mother's blanket," he said, touching the fabric with careful fingers. "It was all I had left of her when she died," Mira admitted. "I used to wrap myself in it when the world felt too big and too cruel. It still smells like her lavender." "Soap! And you gave it to me." "I lent it to you," she corrected gently. "Sometimes we all need something soft to wrap around our hearts when they're too bruised to bear the world's weight." He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised them both. Would you stay just until the storm passes completely?" She settled more comfortably in her chair, tucking her feet under her like a cat finding the perfect spot for sleeping. Of course. They sat together in companionable silence as the storm moved eastward, leaving behind the clean smell of rain and the particular peace that comes after emotional tempests. Silas kept the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and Mira found herself thinking that sometimes healing happened not through grand gestures or profound revelations, but through the simple act of sitting with someone in their darkness until they remembered how to find the light. When morning came, the blanket was folded neatly on his desk, but something fundamental had shifted between them. Silas had allowed her to see him at his most vulnerable, and she had responded not with pity or judgment, but with the kind of practical tenderness that felt like grace. The storm had passed, but its greatest gift wasn't the rain that would green the desert grass. It was the understanding that some wounds could only be healed in the presence of someone brave enough to sit with you while you remembered how to breathe through the pain. The morning after the storm dawned clear and washed, with the particular brightness that comes when the air has been scrubbed clean by rain. Mira woke before sunrise, as was her habit, but found herself lying still in the grey light, thinking about the man who had allowed her to see his deepest vulnerability, and then trusted her enough to ask her to stay. She had slept little. Her mind turning over the image of Silas wrapped in her mother's quilt, his face finally peaceful after hours of torment. There had been something almost sacred about those quiet hours, an intimacy that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with two souls recognizing their shared capacity for wounds that ran deeper than words could reach. But morning, she knew, had a way of making the previous night's revelations feel dangerous in the clear light of day. Men like Silas, who had spent years building careful walls around their hearts, often regretted the moments when those walls came down. She prepared herself for awkwardness, for the possibility that he might retreat even further than before, embarrassed by what he might see as weakness. When she entered the kitchen, however, she found the quilted blanket folded neatly on the table, with a single wildflower placed on top, one of the desert blooms that had appeared after the storm, delicate and impossible in its beauty. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. She was starting the coffee when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and she braced herself for whatever version of Silas would appear, the controlled, distant man she had first met, or perhaps something entirely new. He paused in the doorway, and she could feel him studying her, trying to read her reaction to the previous night's events. When she turned to greet him, she saw uncertainty in his eyes, as though he was a stranger in his own home. "Good morning," she said simply, offering him the same warm smile she had given him every morning since her arrival. "Good morning." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight relief in his expression when she didn't treat him differently. "I wanted to thank you for last night, for sitting with you." She poured his coffee and set it on the table beside the folded quilt. "You don't need to thank me for that. We all have storms, Silas. Some are just louder than others." He picked up the wildflower, turning it between his fingers with the concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "I haven't had an episode like that in years. I thought I was past I thought I had better control. Control is overrated, Mira said, returning to her bread-making with the easy rhythm that had become second nature. Sometimes what we call control is just fear wearing a different coat. You think I'm afraid? There was no offense in his voice, just genuine curiosity. I think you're afraid of the same thing most of us are afraid of, that if we let people see our broken places, they'll decide we're too damaged to love. She shaped the dough with steady hands, not looking at him as she spoke. But broken doesn't mean worthless, Silas. Sometimes it just means human. He was quiet for so long that she wondered if she had overstepped, pushed too hard too soon. But when she finally glanced up, she found him looking at her with something approaching wonder. "You speak as though you know," he said softly. "I know what it's like to lose someone who mattered more than your own life." The words came out before she could stop them, carrying more truth than she had intended to share. "I know what it's like to blame yourself for things that were never in your control." Who did you lose? The simple question hung in the air between them, and Mira realized that in comforting him, she had revealed more of herself than she had meant to. She could feel him waiting, not pushing, but genuinely wanting to understand the woman who had appeared in his life, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. "My sister," she said finally. "Sarah. She was 3 years younger than me, and she was everything good in the world. Gentle and funny and so full of life that just being near her made you feel like you could do anything." She paused in her kneading, her hands stilling as the memories rose unbidden. "We were traveling to California, hoping to find work. The wagon train leader said the river was safe to cross, but it had been raining for days upstream. The current was stronger than anyone expected." Silas waited, understanding that some stories needed to be told in their own time, at their own pace. "Sarah couldn't swim well," Mira continued, her voice growing quieter. "When the wagon overturned, I tried to reach her, but the water was so cold, so fast. I could see her, could hear her calling my name, but I wasn't strong enough. The current carried her away and I never saw her again." "How old were you?" 22. "Old enough to be responsible for her, old enough to know better than to trust someone else's judgment about the river's safety." She resumed kneading, the familiar motion helping to anchor her in the present. "For years, I told myself that if I had been stronger, if I had insisted we wait for better conditions, if I had made different choices." If, Silas said softly, and she realized he understood the particular torture of those 2 letters. "Eventually, I learned that if is just another word for wishing we could rewrite the past. But the past doesn't change. No matter how many times we replay it in our minds, all we can do is decide how we're going to carry it forward." She found Elena's pressed wildflowers in a small wooden box on the windowsill, flowers that had been carefully preserved between sheets of paper, their delicate beauty captured even in death. Taking one out, she placed it beside the fresh bloom Silas had left on the table. "Elena saved these," she said gently, "but she also planted new ones every spring. I think maybe that's the secret, honoring what was beautiful in the past while still making room for new beauty to grow." Silas picked up the pressed flower, examining its faded petals with the reverence of someone handling a holy relic. "I've been so afraid of forgetting her that I forgot how to live with her memory." "Memory isn't fragile," Mira said. "Love isn't fragile. Both are stronger than we give them credit for. Strong enough to survive new experiences, new connections, even new happiness." They stood together in the morning light, 2 people who had learned that survival sometimes meant carrying the dead with you, not as burdens, but as witnesses to the truth that love doesn't end just because breathing does. Outside, the desert was blooming in response to the storm's gift of water. And Mira found herself thinking that perhaps healing was like that too, not something you could force or schedule, but something that happened naturally when the conditions were finally right. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than pained. Would you like to see Elena's garden? I haven't tended it since she died, but after the rain it might be worth seeing." It was an invitation that carried weight beyond its simple words, an offer to share not just a physical space, but the part of his heart where Elena still lived. And when Mira nodded, she was accepting more than just a tour of the grounds. She was accepting the role of witness to a love that had been beautiful enough to survive even death, and perhaps companion to a man ready to learn that honoring the past didn't require abandoning the future. Elena's garden had been overrun by time and neglect, but the storm had awakened something dormant in the soil. Wildflowers pushed through the tangle of dead vines, and the rose bushes, though unpruned for years, had put forth new shoots with a determination that spoke of deep roots and stubborn hope. Mira walked beside Silas along the overgrown paths, watching, as he took in the wild beauty that had emerged from what he had surely seen as failure. His hands hung at his sides, but she could see the way his fingers twitched toward plants that needed tending, the gardener in him responding to life that persisted despite abandonment. "She designed this whole space," he said, his voice carrying wonder rather than pain. "Drew it out on paper first, planned where each plant would go, how the colors would look together in different seasons. She said gardens were like prayers made visible, proof that you believed in tomorrow." Mira knelt beside a cluster of wild lupines that had seeded themselves among Elena's carefully planned beds. She was right. Look how these have made themselves at home. Elena's garden is still growing, still creating beauty. She's still here in a way. Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Mira's breath catch. An ornate pocket. Watch, its gold surface worn smooth by decades of handling. He opened it with the reverence of someone revealing sacred text, and she saw that the inside cover held a small photograph of a stern-faced man who bore a strong resemblance to Silas himself. "My father's watch," he explained, running his thumb across the photograph. "He gave it to me before I left for the war, said it had been passed down through 4 generations of Creed men. Time is the only thing we really own," he told me. "Use it wisely." He closed the watch and held it in his palm, its weight seeming to anchor him to something larger than his immediate grief. "I stopped carrying it after Elena died. Stopped caring about time altogether, really. What was the point of measuring something I didn't want to keep living through?" "But you're carrying it now," Mira observed gently. "I found it this morning. When I was looking for—" He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I was looking for Elena's jewelry box. I thought maybe it was time to do something with her things, besides just preserving them like museum pieces." They continued walking through the garden, and Mira could see him beginning to envision what it could become with care. He pointed out where Elena had planted herbs for cooking, where she had coaxed climbing roses to cover an old arbor, where she had insisted on placing a bench despite his protests that the view wasn't particularly special. She said the view wasn't the point, he remembered, settling onto the weathered bench. She said the point was having a place to sit and watch things grow. Mira joined him on the bench, and together they looked out over the garden's wild resurrection. In the distance, she could see ranch hands going about their work, and she realized that life had continued here even during Silas's withdrawal from it. The ranch was more than just a monument to his grief. It was a living enterprise that employed families, provided for livestock, contributed to the community's well-being. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. "Before Elena died, what was it like?" Silas's expression softened as he drew on happier memories. "Busy. Elena loved having people around. Ranch hands for meals, neighbors for socials, traveling ministers for Sunday services. She turned this place into the heart of the community without even trying. It just happened naturally because she was like sunlight. People were drawn to her warmth. And you? What were you like then?" He was quiet for a moment, consulting the pocket watch as though it might hold answers to questions he had forgotten how to ask. "I was different. Lighter, I suppose. Eleanor had a way of bringing out the best in people, and I was no exception. I laughed more, worried less, believed that good things were not only possible but probable. Those parts of you didn't die with Elena, Mira said carefully. They've just been sleeping. Have they? He looked at her with genuine curiosity, as though she might have insights into his own nature that had escaped him. I see glimpses, she admitted. When you talk about her, when you show me her garden, when you trusted me enough to let me sit with you during the storm, the man Eleanor fell in love with is still there, Silas. He's just been afraid to come out and see what the world looks like. Now, a ranch hand approached from across the yard, hat in hand, clearly reluctant to interrupt, but needing guidance about something. Silas rose to meet him, and Mira watched as he shifted into his role as employer and decision-maker. Even in this, she could see the man Elena had known, fair, decisive, genuinely concerned about his workers' welfare. When the consultation was finished and they were alone again, Silas returned to the bench with a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about memory not being fragile. I've spent so much energy trying to preserve everything exactly as it was that I forgot Elena wasn't someone who believed in staying still. What do you mean? She was always changing things, improving them, finding new ways to make life more beautiful. If she could see this garden now, she wouldn't want it left exactly as she planted it. She'd want it to grow, to adapt, to become something new, while still honoring what came before. He opened the pocket watch again, and this time when he looked at his father's photograph, Mira saw acceptance rather than burden. Time is the only thing we really own, he repeated. I think I've been wasting mine by refusing to let it move forward. As they walked back toward the house, Silas began pointing out plants that needed attention, areas where new flowers might thrive, places where Eleanor's original design could be enhanced rather than simply maintained. It was the first time since her arrival that Mira had seen him look toward the future with anything approaching enthusiasm. That evening he joined her for supper at the dining room table instead of taking his meal in solitude. The conversation was still careful, still tentative, but there was a quality of shared purpose that hadn't existed before. They were no longer just employer and employee dancing around each other's damage. They were two people who had begun to trust each other with their authentic selves. After the meal, as Mira cleared the dishes, Silas lingered at the table, consulting his father's watch with the air of someone making an important decision. Mira, he said finally, would you help me with Elena's garden? I think it's time to let it grow again. She turned from the sink, dish towel in hand, and saw in his face something she had been hoping for since the day she arrived. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of hope. The pocket watch gleamed in the lamplight, its steady ticking, marking time that was finally moving forward instead of standing still. I'd be honored, she said simply, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who looked as though he had traveled hard and fast to reach the ranch. Mira accepted it at the door while Silas was out checking the fence lines, noting the way the young man's eyes darted nervously around the property before he mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. The envelope was addressed. To her, in handwriting, she recognized with a sinking heart her brother Thomas's careful script, though the paper was cheaper than any they had used growing up, and the edges were stained with what looked like desperation. She carried the letter to her room, hands trembling slightly as she broke the seal. Thomas had never been one for frequent correspondence, and his letters usually came with requests she couldn't fulfill and guilt she couldn't escape. This one, she sensed, would be no different. Mira, I hope this finds you well, though I suspect you're doing better than the rest of us. Word reached us that you found a position with the wealthy Cowboy up in New Mexico, the one they call the Phantom Rancher. People say he's got more money than sense and no family to speak of. That makes you sitting pretty, doesn't it, sister? Things here have gone from bad to worse. Pa lost the last of the farm to debt, and we're all of us scattered now like leaves, in a bad wind. Ma's taken sick, and the doctor says she needs medicine we can't afford. Little Mary's working in a factory that's killing her by inches, but it's the only work to be had. I won't sugarcoat this, Mira. We need help, and you're the only one of us who's landed somewhere that might have help to give. I know you always said you couldn't support us all, but maybe your employer would be willing to help out family in need. Rich men like charity cases, don't they? Makes them feel good about themselves. There's something else too, something you should know about that land your cowboy thinks he owns. Pa did some digging before he lost everything, and it turns out there might be questions about the original deed. Questions that could work in our favor if we knew how to ask them right. I'm not saying we'd want to make trouble for your position, but a man with deep pockets might be willing to help a family avoid having to look too closely at old paperwork. If you understand my meaning, write back soon, Mira. Ma's getting worse, and we can't wait much longer. Your loving brother, Thomas. Mira read the letter 3 times, each reading making her feel sicker than the last. The tattered paper seemed to burn in her hands, evidence of the desperate scheme that her family was hatching, using her position at the ranch as leverage for what amounted to extortion. She had fled her family's desperate circumstances 2 years ago, tired of being the one expected to sacrifice everything for people who took her devotion for granted. Her mother's illness was real, of that she had no doubt, but Thomas's suggestion about questionable land deeds was something else entirely. Something that could destroy the fragile peace Silas had begun to find, and destroy her along with it. She was still staring at the letter when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Quickly, she folded the paper and tucked it into her carpet bag, her heart racing with the particular guilt that comes from keeping dangerous secrets. "Mira?" Silas's voice carried concern. "I saw the rider leaving. Everything all right?" "Fine," she called back, hating the way the lie felt in her mouth. "Just family correspondence." But when she emerged from her room, she could see that her face had betrayed her. Silas took one look at her expression and frowned. The careful intuition he had developed during their weeks together, picking up on distress she couldn't quite hide. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently. "Bad news?" "Nothing I can't handle," she said, but the words came out too quickly, too bright. That afternoon, as they worked together in Elena's garden, Mira found herself watching Silas with new eyes. He moved among the plants with growing confidence, his hands gentle as he cleared away dead growth to make room for new life. He had begun to smile again in small, unconscious moments, and she could see glimpses of the man Eleanor had fallen in love with, someone capable of joy, of hope, of trusting that tomorrow might be better than today. The thought of her family's scheme destroying this fragile healing made her stomach turn. But the thought of her mother dying while she did nothing was equally unbearable. She was trapped between loyalties, between the family that had raised her and the man who had begun to trust her with his carefully guarded heart. "Silas," she said carefully, testing the waters, "what do you know about the original land grants?" "For this area?" He looked up from the rosebush he was pruning, surprised by the seemingly random question. "The usual complications, I suppose. Mexican land grants, territorial transfers, statehood adjustments. My grandfather sorted most of it out when he first acquired the property. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. It must be complicated, owning so much land. Complicated enough that I pay a lawyer in Santa Fe to keep track of all the paperwork." He returned to his work, but she could see that her question had stirred something, not alarm exactly, but a kind of alertness that suggested he understood that land ownership in the territories was never as simple as it appeared. That evening, she found herself unable to eat the supper she had prepared. Silas noticed, of course. He had begun, paying attention to her moods the way she had learned to read his, and her distraction was as obvious as a storm cloud on a clear day. "Mira," he said finally, setting down his fork, "whatever's troubling you, it's eating you alive. I've learned something about carrying burdens alone. It doesn't make them lighter." She looked at him across the table, this man who had shared his deepest pain with her, who had allowed her to see him at his most vulnerable, who had begun to trust her with pieces of his heart he had thought too broken to share. The weight of Thomas's letter seemed to press against her chest like a stone. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the people we love ask us to do things that go against everything we believe is right. And sometimes," he replied, his voice gentle with understanding, "we have to choose between different kinds of love. The love that enables and the love that protects." She met his eyes, seeing in them a wisdom born of his own difficult choices, his own experience with loyalty that came at too high a price. And in that moment, she realized that whatever her family was planning, whatever pressure they tried to bring to bear, she had already made her choice. She couldn't save her family by destroying the man who had taught her that healing was possible. She couldn't buy her mother's life with Silas's peace. Some prices were simply too high to pay, no matter how desperate the need. But knowing what was right didn't make it hurt less. And as she looked at the man sitting across from her, she wondered if there was any way to protect him from the storm that was coming, without losing everything she had begun to hope might be possible between them. November brought the first serious frost to the high desert, turning the world silver in the early morning hours before the sun burned the ice away. Mira had grown to love these quiet moments before dawn, when she could move through the house like a spirit, preparing for the day while Silas still slept. She was particularly grateful for the solitude this morning, as it gave her time to wrestle with the growing weight of Thomas's letter. 3 weeks had passed since its arrival, and each day made it harder to pretend that her family's demands would simply disappear if she ignored them. But each day also made it harder to imagine destroying the fragile happiness that was beginning to bloom between her and Silas. Their relationship had settled into something that felt almost like partnership. They worked together in Elena's garden most afternoons, their conversations ranging from practical matters, which plants needed winter protection, where to place new bulbs for spring, to deeper territory that surprised them both. Silas had begun sharing memories not just of Elena, but of his childhood, his time in the war, his dreams for the ranch's future. And Mira found herself revealing pieces of her own story, carefully avoiding the present crisis while speaking honestly about her past. This morning, she was putting the finishing touches on a set of lace doilies she had been crocheting in the evenings. The delicate work reminded her of her mother's hands, always busy with some small project that would make their humble home more beautiful. These doilies were different, though. They were made with love for a place she had begun to think of as home, rather than duty to people who took her sacrifice for granted. She was arranging the largest doily under the sitting room lamp when she heard Silas's footsteps on the stairs. He had been rising earlier lately, drawn perhaps by the same peaceful quality of the pre-dawn hours, or maybe simply because he had begun to enjoy their quiet conversations over morning coffee. "Those are beautiful," he said, pausing to examine her handiwork. Elena would have loved them. She always said a house became a home through small touches that showed someone cared about the people who lived there. Mira felt a familiar pang at the mention of Elena, but it was softer now, tinged with affection rather than the sharp jealousy she might have expected. "I hope you don't mind. I know the house is already perfect, but I think they're exactly what this place needed," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up from her work. "You've brought life back to rooms that had forgotten what they were for." They had breakfast together, as had become their custom, but today Silas seemed unusually thoughtful, as though he was turning over some important decision. Finally, as she was clearing the dishes, he spoke. "Would you like to learn to ride?" he asked. "Properly, I mean. I know you can manage the old mare we use for errands, but there's more to this land than what you can see from the house. I thought maybe you'd like to see it." The offer carried weight beyond its simple words. Silas was not just suggesting riding lessons. He was offering to share with her the vast beauty of his domain, to show her the places that mattered to him, to include her in the part of his life that existed beyond the boundaries of house and garden. "I'd love that," she said, and meant it completely. Their first real ride took them across pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, through stands of juniper and pinon that filled the air with their clean scent, up into foothills where the view stretched for miles in every direction. Silas had chosen a gentle mare for her, but one with enough spirit to make the ride interesting, and Mira found herself exhilarated by the freedom of movement, the feeling of partnership with such a magnificent animal. "There," Silas said, pointing, toward a distant ridge. "That's where Elena and I used to go for picnics. She said it was the closest to heaven you could get without leaving the earth." Mira could see why Elena had loved the spot. It commanded a view of the entire valley, with the ranch house looking small and perfect in the distance, surrounded by the careful geometry of fenced pastures and the wild beauty of the desert beyond. "Tell me about those picnics," she said, genuinely curious about the life he and Elena had built together. To her surprise, he smiled, a real smile, warm with genuine happiness rather than the careful politeness she had grown accustomed to. "She always packed too much food and insisted on bringing a tablecloth, even though we were eating on rocks. She'd spend the whole ride up talking about her plans for the garden, or some book she was reading, or which of the ranch hands was going to marry which girl from town. She kept track of everyone's romances. Elena believed in love, the way some people believe in the weather. She knew it was always happening somewhere, and she took personal joy in watching it unfold." His expression grew thoughtful. "She used to say that love was like wildflowers. It grew best when people weren't trying too hard to control it." They dismounted and sat on a fallen log, sharing the simple lunch Mira had packed. The November sun was warm despite the season, and the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the small sounds of wind and birds and horses cropping grass nearby. "Mira," Silas said finally, his voice careful in the way it got when he was about to venture into emotional territory. "I want you to know that these past weeks, they've meant more to me than I know how to say. I'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow." She felt her heart clench, thinking of Thomas's letter, of the storm that was surely coming, of how much this moment of peace might cost them both. "Silas, I know it's too soon," he said quickly, misreading her hesitation. "I know you signed on to be a housekeeper, not to help a broken man remember how to be human. But I wanted you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope," he said simply. "The belief that maybe the best parts of life aren't all behind me." Mira looked out over the valley, seeing it through Elena's eyes, a place where love could flourish, where two people could build something beautiful together, where the future stretched bright with possibility. The handmade lace doilies in her bag seemed to represent everything she had begun to dream of. A life where her careful attention to beauty was welcomed, where her gentle presence was valued, where she could love and be loved without reservation. But Thomas's letter burned in her memory like a brand, and she knew that this moment of perfect peace was fragile as spun glass. Her family's desperation would not wait for her heart to heal or for Silas to fully emerge from his long grief. The reckoning was coming, and when it did, it would test everything they had built together. "I need to tell you something," she began. But Silas shook his head. "Not today," he said gently. "Whatever's been troubling you, it can wait until tomorrow. Today, I just want to sit here with you and remember what it feels like to be grateful for right now." So she let herself have this moment, this perfect, impossible moment when she could pretend that love was simple, that the future stretched bright before them, that the careful threads she had woven into her new life wouldn't be cut by the sharp edges of family obligation and desperate need. The ride home was peaceful, their horses walking side by side through the gathering dusk. And if Mira treasured each moment with unusual intensity, If she memorized the way the evening light turned Silas's face golden, if she held too tightly to his hand when he helped her dismount, well, perhaps some moments were meant to be held that way, with the fierce tenderness of someone who knows that tomorrow might take everything away. The second letter arrived on a grey December morning, but this time it wasn't delivered by a nervous rider. Instead, Thomas Callan himself stood on the front porch of the Creed Ranch, his hat in his hands and desperation written across every line of his weathered face. Mira opened the door to find her brother's familiar blue eyes staring back at her, eyes that had once been bright with shared laughter but now held the hollow look of a man who had run out of options. Behind him stood two other men she didn't recognize, their presence suggesting this wasn't a social call. "Hello, sister," Thomas said, his voice carrying the particular weight that came with family obligations and unspoken debts. "Might we come? We've traveled a long way, and we need to talk." Mira's heart hammered against her ribs as she glanced toward the study where Silas was reviewing ranch accounts. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, but somehow its arrival still felt like a physical blow. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" "Ma died 3 weeks ago," he said without preamble, and despite everything, Mira felt the words hit her like a physical force. "We buried her in the church cemetery back home. Thought you might want to know." The grief was immediate and overwhelming, complicated by guilt that she hadn't been there, hadn't helped, hadn't found a way to save the woman who had raised her with gentle hands and endless patience. Thomas watched her reaction with the calculating gaze of someone who knew exactly how to use emotional leverage. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I didn't know. If I had known..." "You'd have what? Sent money you don't have? Come home to watch her die?" Thomas stepped closer, and she could smell the desperation on him, the particular odor of a man who had traveled hard and slept rough and was running on nothing but stubborn determination. "Or maybe you'd have convinced your wealthy employer to help out a poor family in need." Before Mira could respond, she heard footsteps behind her. Silas appeared in the hallway, his posture alert in the way it got when he sensed potential trouble. His eyes took in the scene quickly. Mira's tears, Thomas's aggressive stance, the two strangers flanking him like hired muscle. "Miss Callan," Silas said carefully, "is everything all right?" Thomas's expression shifted as he took in the man before him, tall, prosperous, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. This was clearly the wealthy cowboy he had come to see, and Mira could practically see him recalibrating his approach. "Mr. Creed, I presume," Thomas said, straightening his shoulders and attempting something like dignity. "I'm Thomas Callan, Mira's brother. I'm afraid I bring sad news about our mother's passing." "I'm sorry for your loss," Silas replied, his tone properly sympathetic but guarded. "Please come in. Mira, perhaps your brother would like some coffee after his journey." As they moved into the sitting room, Mira caught sight of the legal documents. One of Thomas's companions was carrying official-looking papers that made her stomach clench with dread. This wasn't just about their mother's death or a request for financial help. This was about the land deed scheme Thomas had hinted at in his letter. "Mr. Creed," Thomas began once they were seated, "I'll be direct with you because I think you're a man who appreciates honesty. My family's been going through some hard times, and when Ma took sick, we had to do some research into ways we might raise funds for her care." Silas's expression remained carefully neutral, but Mira could see the tension gathering in his shoulders. "I see." One of Thomas's companions, a thin man with predatory eyes, withdrew a sheaf of papers from his coat. "Mr. Creed, are you familiar with the original Mexican land grant that covers this property?" "Reasonably," Silas replied, his voice growing cooler. "Well, sir, it seems there might be some irregularities in the transfer documents your grandfather used when he acquired this land." The man spread the papers on the coffee table with the flourish of someone revealing a winning hand at cards. "Questions about whether the original grantee had the legal right to sell, whether the territorial government had proper authority to validate the transfer." Mira felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was happening. Her family wasn't just asking for charity, they were challenging Silas's legal right to own the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. These documents, Thomas continued, suggest that the Callan family, our father's people, might have a legitimate claim to at least a portion of this land. Now, we're not unreasonable people, Mr. Creed. We understand that you've invested years and considerable resources into this property. We wouldn't want to see anyone lose their home over old paperwork. What exactly are you proposing? Silas asked, and Mira could hear the controlled anger beneath his polite tone. A settlement, the thin man said smoothly. A sum that would compensate the Callan family for their potential claim, while allowing you to maintain clear title to your property. Shall we say $50,000? The number hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. $50,000, more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to solve Thomas's problems and set up the entire Callan family for life. And all it would cost was Silas's faith in the legal foundation of everything he had built. Mira found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Thomas, you can't do this. Can't do what, sister? Can't try to claim what's rightfully ours? Can't try to save our family from destitution? Thomas's eyes were hard now, the desperate gleam of a cornered animal. You've been living comfortable up here while the rest of us scraped for every meal. Seems to me it's time you remembered where your loyalties lie. Silas stood slowly, his movement controlled, but dangerous. Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to leave, if you believe you have a legitimate legal claim to this property. I suggest you take it up with the territorial courts. But I won't be intimidated into paying extortion money based on questionable documents and family pressure. Oh, but Mr. Creed, the thin man said with an oily smile, there's something else you should consider. Your housekeeper here, she's been aware of our family's potential claim for some time now. Haven't you, Miss Callan? All eyes turned to Mira, and she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was the moment she had dreaded, the reckoning that would destroy everything she had built with Silas. His face was carefully blank, but she could see the questions forming behind his eyes, the terrible understanding that she had been keeping secrets that could devastate his life. Is that true? Silas asked quietly, and the pain in his voice nearly undid her. I received a letter, she admitted, her voice breaking. Thomas wrote about questions regarding the land deed, but I would never what? Thomas pressed. Never help your own family, never tell us what you learned about this man's vulnerabilities. Come now, Mira, surely you shared information that helped us understand how to approach this situation. That's not true. Mira stood, desperation making her voice stronger. I never told you anything about Silas or the ranch. I never helped you plan this attack on his home. But she could see from Silas's expression that the damage was done. In his eyes, she read the terrible recognition of betrayal, not because she had conspired against him, but because she had known about the threat and hadn't warned him. She had allowed him to trust her, to care for her, to hope for a future with her, all while knowing that her family was planning to destroy his peace. Silas, she whispered, reaching toward him, please let me explain. He stepped back from her, outstretched hand, and that simple movement felt like a physical blow. I think, he said quietly, you've explained enough. Thomas smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully divided his enemies. Mr. Creed, you have 1 week to consider our proposal. After that, we'll be filing papers with the territorial court. And when this becomes a public legal battle, well, small communities do love their gossip about wealthy men who might have built their fortunes on stolen land. As her family prepared to leave, Mira felt her world crumbling around her. She had lost her mother, she was losing Silas, and she was watching the only home she had ever truly loved being torn apart by the desperate greed of people who shared her blood, but not her values. The legal documents lay scattered on the coffee table like accusations, and Mira realized that sometimes the worst betrayals came not from enemies, but from the people who were supposed to love you enough to want your happiness more than their own survival. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was deafening. Mira stood in the sitting room, surrounded by the scattered legal documents and the wreckage of everything she had hoped to build, while Silas remained by the window, his back to her, as he stared out at the land his family had called home for. 3 generations. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched at his sides, and she knew he was fighting the same battle she had watched him wage with his grief, the struggle between feeling too much and feeling nothing at all. But this time, she was the source of his pain rather than its comfort. "How long?" he asked finally, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "Since the first letter arrived. 6 weeks ago." The admission felt like pulling splinters from her own heart, but she owed him the truth, even if it came too late to matter. 6 weeks. He turned to face her, and the careful control in his expression was somehow worse than anger would have been. 6 weeks you've known that your family was planning to, what would you call this, Mira? Extortion, fraud, an attempt to steal everything my grandfather built. "I don't know what to call it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew Thomas was desperate, but I never imagined he would go this far. I never thought he would actually come here and what? Threaten to destroy my life unless I pay him to leave me alone?" Silas moved closer, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could keep this secret while letting me fall in?" He stopped abruptly, as though the words were too dangerous to speak aloud. "While letting you fall in what?" she whispered, though she thought she knew, and the knowledge broke her heart all over again. "It doesn't matter now." He turned away again, and she saw him notice something on his desk, a torn piece of paper. That hadn't been there before. With growing dread, she watched him pick it up and read the contents, his face growing paler with each word. It was his marriage certificate to Elena, the one Thomas's companion must have found while they were touring the house. But now it was torn nearly in half, the delicate paper ripped along the line where their names were joined, as though someone had tried to literally tear apart the legal bond that had united them. "They were in my study," Silas said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "While we were talking, one of them was going through my private papers. Looking for what, Mira? More ammunition to use against me?" "I didn't know," she said desperately. "Silas, you have to believe me. I had no idea they wouldn't you?" He held up the torn certificate, and she could see his hands shaking with suppressed fury. "Your own brother just threatened to destroy my family's legacy unless I pay him $50,000. Your family went through my private documents, damaged something that can never be replaced, and you want me to believe you had no part in any of it." "I didn't." The words came out as a sob. "I swear to you on my mother's grave, I never told them anything that would help them hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen, but you knew it might." His voice was deadly quiet now, the tone of a man who had reached the end of his capacity for pain. "You knew your family was planning something, and you chose to protect them instead of warning me." "I chose to protect you!" The words burst from her with such force that they both seemed surprised by their intensity. "I chose to stay here, to refuse their demands, to try to find another way to help my family without destroying you. I chose you, Silas. I chose this life we were building together. Did you?" He set the torn certificate down with infinite care, as though it were made of spun glass. "Or did you choose to keep your options open? To let me trust you, care for you, hope for a future with you, all while knowing that at any moment your family might come here and tear my world apart?" Mira sank into a chair, the weight of his accusations and her own guilt making it impossible to stand. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I was afraid that if I told you about Thomas's letter, you'd send me away. I was afraid you'd think I was part of their scheme. I was afraid of losing the only home I've ever truly had. So instead you chose to lose it by lying to me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you have any idea what this feels like, Mira? To discover that the person you've begun to trust with your heart has been keeping secrets that could destroy everything you hold dear. I know exactly what it feels like, she said, looking up at him with eyes that held their own pain. I know what it feels like to lose everything that matters. I know what it feels like to be betrayed by people who are supposed to love you. And I know what it feels like to make choices that hurt the people you care about most, even when you're trying to protect them. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, of the truth in her words, but it was quickly replaced by the familiar mask of careful control. I need you to leave, he said quietly. Pack your things and go. I'll pay you through the end of the month, but I can't have you here while I try to figure out how to fight this. I can't look at you and not wonder what else you've been keeping from me. Silas, please. She stood, desperate to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Don't let them destroy what we've built together. Don't let their desperation and greed poison what we have. What we have, he looked at her with something approaching pity. What we have is built on a foundation of lies and half-truths. What we have is me trusting someone who knew my enemies were planning to attack and chose not to warn me. What we have is you letting me fall in love with you while you carried secrets that could ruin my life. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that had been burned beyond repair. He had said it at last, that he loved her or had been learning to love her, but the confession came wrapped in betrayal and pain, making it feel more like an accusation than a gift. I love you too, she whispered, knowing it was too late, but needing to say it anyway. I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. I love you enough to want to protect you from my family's desperation. I love you enough to sacrifice my own happiness rather than see you hurt. If that's love, he said, turning away from her, then I understand why you've been alone most of your life. Love without trust is just another word for torture. Mira felt something inside her break apart completely. Not just her heart, but her hope, her faith in the possibility that someone like her could find happiness with someone like him. She had gambled everything on the belief that love could survive secrets, that protection and deception were sometimes the same thing, that good intentions could somehow shield the people you cared about from the consequences of terrible choices. She had been wrong. As she climbed the stairs to pack her few belongings, she could hear Silas in his study, and she knew he was looking at the torn marriage certificate, trying to piece together something that had been deliberately destroyed. It seemed fitting, somehow, that her family's attack on his happiness had included the destruction of a symbol of the love that had come before her. Some things, she realized, could not be repaired once they were broken. Some betrayals were too deep to forgive, no matter how pure the intentions behind them. And some kinds of love were too fragile to survive the weight of family loyalty and desperate choices. The packed suitcase in her hands held everything she owned in the world, but as she prepared to leave the only place that had ever felt like home, Mira understood that the most valuable thing she was losing couldn't be folded and carried away. Trust, once broken, became a ghost that haunted every future relationship. Hope, once shattered, left scars that never fully healed. And love, once poisoned by secrets and lies, became just another source of pain, rather than the healing force she had believed it could be. The boarding house in town was exactly what Mira had expected. Clean enough, quiet enough, and empty enough to make her feel like she was living in the hollow shell of someone else's life. Her room was small and sparse, with a single window that looked out onto the main street, where dust swirled in endless circles, and people went about their business without knowing or caring that her world had ended 3 days ago. She had taken the only job available, helping Mrs. Patterson at the general store during the busy holiday season, and found a bitter irony in the fact that she was now surrounded by gossip about the very situation she had helped create. The entire town was buzzing with news about the Creed Ranch, about mysterious legal challenges and family disputes, about how the Phantom Rancher had finally emerged from his isolation only to face the loss of everything his family had built. Shame. About Mr. Creed, Mrs. Patterson said, as they arranged Christmas merchandise on the shelves. Just when it seemed like he might be finding his way back to the living, this trouble comes along to knock him down again. Mira kept her head down, focusing on the task of pricing ribbon, and trying not to let her employer see how much the casual observation hurt. Have you heard anything specific about the legal proceedings? Well, folks are saying those Callan people. No relation to you, I hope, dear. Are claiming some kind of old family right to the land. Papers from the Mexican land, grant days, supposedly. Of course, most people think it's just opportunists looking to take advantage of a good man's misfortune. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Most people thought exactly what was true, that her family were opportunists and fraudsters. But they also assumed she was innocent, that her connection to the Callan name was coincidental rather than the very foundation of the betrayal that had destroyed the only happiness she had ever known. Her packed suitcase sat in the corner of her room like an accusation, and every evening she found herself staring at it, wondering if she should simply leave town entirely. There was nothing keeping her here except the masochistic desire to remain close to the life she had lost, to catch glimpses of Silas when he came to town for supplies, to torture herself with the knowledge that he was only a few miles away, but might as well have been on the other side of the world. On the fourth evening of her exile, she was sitting by her window when she saw a familiar figure riding down the main street. Silas sat his horse with the same easy authority she remembered, but even from a distance she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man expecting attack from any direction. He dismounted in front of the lawyer's office and disappeared inside, and Mira found herself pressing her face to the glass like a child, desperate for any glimpse of the man she loved and had lost through her own terrible choices. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his expression was grimmer than before, and she knew the news about the legal challenge hadn't been good. She watched him mount his horse and ride out of town without looking up at her window, without any acknowledgement that she existed in the same world he inhabited. The finality of his indifference was somehow worse than anger would have been. At least, anger suggested she still mattered enough to warrant strong emotion. That night, she sat at the small table in her room and wrote letters she would never send. Letters to Silas explaining everything she should have told him from the beginning. Letters to Thomas, telling him exactly what she thought of his scheme and his willingness to destroy innocent people for money. Letters to her dead mother, apologizing for failing to save her, for choosing love over family loyalty, for being too weak to find a solution that could have protected everyone she cared about. But as she wrote, she began to understand something that had eluded her during the emotional chaos of the past few days. Her choice hadn't really been between Silas and her family. It had been between enabling her family's destructive desperation and protecting an innocent man from becoming their victim. Thomas would have found a way to pursue his scheme with or without her cooperation, but at least she had refused to be his accomplice. The knowledge didn't ease the pain of losing Silas, but it did restore some small measure of self-respect. She had made mistakes, terrible, costly mistakes, but her intentions had been honorable, even if her methods had been flawed. Still, intentions didn't heal broken trust. Honor didn't repair shattered relationships, and as the December wind rattled her window, Mira faced the possibility that some kinds of damage simply couldn't be undone, no matter how much love remained beneath the wreckage. She thought of the ranch house sitting empty except for Silas and his ghosts, of Elena's garden returning to wilderness without her care, of the sitting room where her lace doilies probably still graced the tables like monuments to a happiness that had proved too fragile to survive the test of real adversity. Most of all, she thought of Silas alone in his study, perhaps looking at the torn marriage certificate and wondering if he was destined to lose everyone he allowed himself to care about. The thought of him retreating back into the careful isolation that had protected him for so many years, of him deciding that love was simply too dangerous to risk, made her chest ache, with a pain that had nothing to do with her own loss and everything to do with genuine concern for the man who had trusted her with his healing heart. She had failed to protect him from her family's greed, but perhaps she could still protect him from the larger damage of believing that love itself was a lie. Perhaps there was still something she could do to ensure that her mistakes didn't destroy his capacity for future happiness, even if that happiness would never include her. The packed suitcase seemed to mock her from its corner, reminding her that she was living in limbo, neither moving forward nor truly staying put. But as she sat in the gathering darkness, Mira began to formulate a plan that would require more courage than anything she had ever attempted, a plan that might cost her everything she had left, but might also give Silas back the future she had helped steal from him. Tomorrow, she decided, she would stop running from the consequences of her choices and start fighting for the man she loved, even if fighting for him meant losing any chance of winning him back. The Santa Fe lawyer's office smelled of leather and old paper, with the particular mustiness that comes from decades of handling other people's complicated lives. Mira sat in the waiting room, her hands folded in her lap and her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to do something that would either save Silas or destroy what remained of her own dignity. She had spent 3 days researching territorial land law in the town's small library, writing careful letters to government offices, and gathering every scrap of information she could find about the original Mexican land grants in the area. What she had discovered was both better and worse than she had feared. Better because Thomas's claim was even more fraudulent than she had suspected. Worse because proving it would require her to testify against her own family in open court. "Miss Collin?" The lawyer's secretary appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Harrison will see you now." James Harrison was exactly what she had expected from his reputation. A sharp-eyed man in his 50s who had built his practice on territorial land disputes and had the particular air of someone who had seen every variety of human greed and desperation. He studied her with the assessing gaze of someone trying to determine whether she was going to waste his time. "Miss Callan," he said, settling behind his desk, "your letter was intriguing. You say you have information about the greed land dispute that might be of interest to my client." "I have information that will end the dispute," Mira said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "But before I share it, I need your word that everything I tell you will be used only to protect Mr. Creed's interests. I'm not looking for compensation or recognition. I just want this matter resolved in favor of the rightful owner." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an unusual position for someone who shares a name with the plaintiffs. Are you related to Thomas Callan?" "He's my brother." The admission felt like swallowing ground glass. "And what he's doing to Mr. Creed is wrong. More than wrong, it's criminal fraud based on forged documents and fabricated family history." She opened her reticule and withdrew a folder of papers she had painstakingly assembled. "The Callan family has no legitimate claim to any part of the Creed ranch. Our family has never owned property in New Mexico, and the documents my brother is using to support his case are either forgeries or alterations of unrelated land grants from completely different territories." Harrison leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "How do you know this?" "Because I have the real family documents." Mira spread the papers across his desk with the precision of someone laying out evidence for a jury. Birth certificates, marriage records, immigration papers, land purchases, everything that proves the Callan family's actual history. "We came to this country as poor Irish immigrants and never owned anything more valuable than a failed farm in Kansas. And you're willing to testify to this in court against your own family?" Mira thought of Silas alone in his study, looking at his torn marriage certificate and wondering if he was destined to lose everything he cared about. She thought of Elena's garden returning to wilderness, of the ranch hands who depended on the greed property for their livelihoods, of a good man being punished for the simple crime of allowing himself to hope again. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'll testify to whatever you need me to say, as long as it's the truth." Harrison gathered the documents and began examining them with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years separating genuine claims from fraudulent ones. After several minutes, he looked up with something approaching admiration. "Miss Callan, these documents don't just disprove your brother's claim. They provide clear evidence of deliberate fraud. If I present this evidence to the territorial court, your brother and his associates will likely face criminal charges." "I understand." Mira's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she contemplated the full implications of her choice. "They're my family, Mr. Harrison, but what they're doing is wrong. They're trying to destroy a good man because they think his kindness makes him vulnerable. I won't be part of that. There's something else you should know," Harrison continued, his expression growing more serious. "Mr. Creed has been preparing for a fight. He's hired investigators, secured character witnesses, even considered liquidating assets to mount a defense. He's not going to surrender his family's legacy without a battle." The image of Silas preparing for war broke Mira's heart all over again. She could picture him in his study, surrounded by legal documents and battle plans, his old military training kicking in as he prepared to defend what was his. But she also knew what that kind of fight would cost him, not just in money and time, but in the trust and peace he had worked so hard to rebuild. "He shouldn't have to fight," she said quietly. "He's been through enough. He deserves to live without constantly looking over his shoulder for the next attack." Harrison studied her with new interest. "You care about him. I love him." The words came out without hesitation, carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love him enough to protect him from my family's greed, even if it means I lose any chance of ever having a place in his life again. Miss Callan, there's something I need to tell you about Mr. Creed's preparations for this case." Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "He's been asking questions about you. Specifically, he's been trying to determine the extent of your involvement in your family's scheme." Mira's heart stopped. "What kind of questions? Whether you've been in contact with your brother before his arrival at the ranch, whether you provided information about his property or financial situation, whether you might have been working with them from the beginning." Harrison paused, then added gently, "He's been trying to prove your innocence, Miss Callan, not your guilt." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Even after everything that had happened, even believing she had betrayed him, Silas had been looking for evidence that would exonerate her rather than condemn her. The knowledge was both heartbreaking and healing, proof that somewhere beneath his anger and hurt, he still believed in the woman he had fallen in love with. "What did he find?" she whispered. "Enough to convince himself that you were caught in an impossible situation rather than actively conspiring against him." Harrison gathered the documents and locked them in his desk drawer. "Miss Callan, I'll be honest with you. Mr. Creed is a proud man who's been badly hurt. Even if we resolve this land dispute in his favor, that doesn't mean he'll be ready to forgive what he sees as a fundamental betrayal of trust." "I know." Mira stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that were finally steady. "But at least he'll be safe. At least he'll know that not everyone who claims to care about him is trying to take something from him." As she prepared to leave, Harrison called after her. "Miss Callan, there's one more thing. The hearing is scheduled for next week. When this is over, your brother and his associates will likely leave the territory rather than face criminal prosecution. You'll be alone here, with no family and possibly no prospects for employment. Have you considered what you'll do then?" Mira paused in the doorway, looking back at the man who was about to help her sacrifice everything for love that might never be returned. "I'll figure something out, Mr. Harrison. I always do." But as she walked back toward town through the crisp December air, Mira knew that her future had never been less certain. She was about to testify against her own family, destroy any hope of reconciliation with the people who had raised her, and expose herself to the judgment of a community that might see her actions as either noble or treacherous, depending on their perspective. The only thing she knew for certain was that Silas would be safe, his land secure, his future protected from the particular kind of destruction that came from trusting the wrong people. It wasn't the happy ending she had dreamed of, but it was the right ending, the one that honored love by putting the beloved's welfare above her own happiness. In her dusty gun cabinet back at the ranch, Silas was probably cleaning his father's old service weapons, preparing for a war that would never come now. Soon he would learn that the battle was already over, won by the woman he thought had betrayed him, but who had actually been willing to sacrifice everything to keep him safe. The territorial courthouse was packed beyond capacity on the morning of the hearing, with every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Word had spread throughout the territory about the Creed land dispute, and it seemed half the county had come to witness what promised to be either a spectacular vindication or a devastating downfall. Mira sat in the front row behind the defendants' table, her hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She had dressed in her best dress, a simple grey wool that her mother had helped her sew years ago, and pinned her hair with extra care, understanding that her appearance in this courtroom would be scrutinized and judged by people who would carry their opinions about her character for years to come. Silas sat at the defendant's table with his legal team, his back straight and his expression composed, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He had glanced at her when she entered the courtroom, and she had seen surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope flicker across his features before he turned away. He didn't know she was here to testify for him rather than against him, and she wondered what he must be thinking about her presence at what could be his moment of greatest vulnerability. Thomas and his associates sat across the aisle, looking confident and well-dressed in a way that spoke of money recently acquired and carefully spent on the impression of respectability. Thomas had nodded to her when he entered, his expression unreadable, as though he couldn't quite decide whether her presence was a help or a hindrance to his cause. Judge Morrison called the court to order with the gravity befitting a case that would set precedent for territorial land disputes. He was an older man with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness that had survived 3 decades on the territorial bench. As he reviewed the case documents, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the occasional creak of wooden benches under shifting bodies. This court will hear arguments regarding the disputed ownership of approximately 15,000 acres of land, currently held by Silas Creed, with Thomas Callan and associates claiming prior rights based on Mexican land grant documentation. Judge Morrison announced, "Mr. Patterson, you may present the plaintiff's case." Thomas's lawyer rose with theatrical confidence, spreading documents across the table like a man revealing a winning poker hand. For 30 minutes, he argued that the Callan family had legitimate claim to portions of the Creed Ranch based on a land grant allegedly issued to Mira's great-grandfather in 1848, shortly before the territory was transferred from Mexican to American control. The documents looked official enough, aged paper, elaborate seals, signatures that appeared genuine to untrained eyes. The lawyer painted a picture of a family that had been wrongfully dispossessed of their inheritance, forced to watch while generations of their birthright was developed by others who had no legal right to the land. Mira watched Silas's face during the presentation and saw him grow paler as the full scope of the alleged fraud was laid out. Even knowing that the claims were false, she could understand how devastating it must be to hear his family's legacy characterized as an elaborate theft spanning 3 generations. When Thomas's lawyer finished, Mr. Harrison rose for the defense. With the calm confidence of a man holding unbeatable cards, Your Honor, the defense will demonstrate that the plaintiff's claims are not merely unfounded, but constitute deliberate fraud based on forged documents and fabricated family history. He began by presenting the legitimate land records for the Creed Ranch, documents that showed clear, unbroken chain of title from the original Mexican land grant through territorial transfer to American ownership, with every transaction properly recorded and witnessed. Then he moved to the technical analysis of Thomas's documents, pointing out anachronisms in the paper, inconsistencies in the legal language, and signatures that forensic analysis had revealed to be modern forgeries. But it was when he called Mira to the witness stand that the courtroom truly came alive with tension. She walked to the front of the courtroom on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye following her movement. As she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, she caught sight of Thomas's face and saw the exact moment when he realized what was about to happen. His expression shifted from confidence to shock to desperate anger, and she knew that whatever remained of their family bond was about to be severed forever. "Miss Callan," Harrison began gently, "you are Thomas Callan's sister, are you not? I am. And you have knowledge of your family's actual history that differs from the claims made in this courtroom today?" Mira took a deep breath and looked directly at Silas. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see the questions in his eyes, the desperate hope that she might somehow provide answers that would make sense of everything that had happened between them. "Yes," she said clearly, "everything my brother has claimed about our family's connection to this land is false." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Judge Morrison called for order. Thomas half rose from his seat, his face flushed with fury. Before his lawyer pulled him back down, for the next hour, Mira methodically demolished every aspect of her family's case. She presented the real Callan family documents: immigration records showing their arrival from Ireland in 1862, land purchases in Kansas, birth certificates that proved they had never lived in New Mexico or had any connection to Mexican land grants. She testified about Thomas's letter, acknowledging that the land claim was a desperate scheme, about his explicit threats to use the false documents to extort money from Silas. "Miss Callan," Harrison said, as her testimony neared its end, "you understand that by testifying here today, you are providing evidence that will likely result in criminal charges against your own brother." "I understand. And you're willing to do this because—" Mira looked at Silas again, seeing in his face the full weight of everything they had shared and everything they had lost. "Because Mr. Creed is a good man who has already suffered more, loss than anyone should have to bear. Because he deserves to live in peace on land that has been his family's for 3 generations. And because some things are more important than family loyalty, like truth and justice, and protecting innocent people from those who would destroy them for personal gain." When she stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was utterly silent. Thomas's lawyer attempted to discredit her testimony, suggesting she had been coerced or bribed, but the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Within minutes, Judge Morrison was ready to render his verdict. "Based on the evidence presented," he announced, "this court finds that the plaintiff's claims are not only without merit, but constitute attempted fraud. The defendant's title to the disputed property is confirmed as clear and unencumbered. Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the forged documents to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation." The gavel's fall seemed to echo through the courtroom like a gunshot. Thomas and his associates were already moving toward the exit, clearly planning to leave the territory before criminal charges could be filed. As they passed Mira's row, Thomas stopped and looked down at her with a mixture of betrayal and grudging. "Respect. I hope he was worth it, sister," he said quietly. "Because you'll never have family again." "I know," she replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. "But I'll be able to live with myself." As the courtroom emptied, Mira remained in her seat, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of what she had just done. She had saved Silas's ranch, preserved his family's legacy, and protected him from the particular kind of devastation that comes from losing everything to people you trusted. But she had also made herself an orphan, cutting herself off from the last family connections she possessed in the world. When she finally looked up, she found Silas standing beside her row, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding a depth of emotion that took her breath away.